Okay folks, in this video I plan to go over essentially the table which you had to do last time on pressure groups influencing different branches of government, and then there's a comparison table which I want to quickly go over as well. Again, that may quite a nice comparative issue. And then the video I'll make after this one, it'll either be later on today or probably tomorrow. It'll be about lobbying and the influence of lobbyists and stuff, and there's a bit of a PowerPoint involved in that. So, with further ado, let's look at this table. Again, on the old course, this used to come up quite often as a short 15 marker, explain how and why pressure groups influence the different branches of government. I don't think those will appear on the current exam. However, it is always good with pressure groups to have a nice range of examples of things you can then use. And you can use the examples we'll go through today for a whole range of different questions. So it's good to have a nice range of examples. So, if we look, first of all, we've got the executive. Why do pressure groups seek to influence this branch? Well, that should be fairly straightforward, I'd have thought. The president obviously is very important in decision making. He sets the political agenda of the country. So I think how Trump's agenda is very different to Obama's beforehand, and Obama's was very different to George W. Bush's. The president has a very important role in foreign policy, which again attracts those pressure groups with an interest in particular in foreign policy. The president as well is involved in lots of appointments to the federal judiciary and various other positions as well, which again attracts pressure group interest. So some examples of how they do this. Well, pressure groups can influence them, first of all, by helping their election campaigns, making sure they get, in their view, the right person elected. So campaign finance and campaign donations is important. So, for example, if you look at the 2016, there's a website called opensecrets.org. It's always worth watching or looking at. You can see, for example, that pressure groups who donated to the Hillary Clinton campaign were fairly liberal groups like Emily's List, and they want to see more women elected, basically. They gave $1.3 million. The University of California gave $2.1 million. She received money from various trade union groups, as well as a whole range of business groups as well. I noticed Apple was on there, Microsoft were on there, etc., etc. The Trump campaign, again, he has money from big donations and big donors, groups like the US Chamber of Commerce, for example, some of the big kind of attorneys and these sorts of business groups donated to his campaign. He also had support from groups like the National Rifle Association and various conservative groups. Other methods they might use is lobbying, so they might directly lobby, probably not the president himself because he's obviously surrounded by all his team, but they certainly lobby the federal bureaucracy, cabinet members, people that work in the West Wing, but sometimes they might be more direct. So La Raza, for example, they were a Hispanic pressure group. They were very upset about Obama's kind of lack of progress on immigration reform, and in fact they called him the deporter-in-chief. And they did this in election year as well, which obviously upset Obama. And then following that, he then did some executive orders regarding immigration. There's a pressure group called 350.org. They're a group, they're a kind of an environmental group. They were very pleased when Obama refused to approve the Keystone Pipeline, which was basically this great big pipeline that would go from like Canada down to Louisiana carrying oil. They believed this would be bad for the environment and they opposed it. Obviously the lobbying group, the oil group for example, they were very much in support of this, so they were quite upset that Obama signed this. So there are just some examples. As I said, things like Supreme Court appointments are made by the president, and again pressure groups might try to put pressure on through lobbying, through donation to election campaigns, all that type of stuff. But we'll discuss Supreme Court appointments probably when we do the Senate, and some of these points will figure into the presidency as well. Okay then, so the Senate. Why do pressure groups seek to influence the Senate? Well, the obvious one is because it passes laws, which is exactly the same for the House of Representatives thing. But then, of course, he's got these special powers, hasn't it, the Senate as well? So these exclusive powers. So, for example, interviewing and I suppose formally appointing members of the Supreme Court. They've got their role in foreign policy regarding treaties, for example. So there's various exclusive powers, which makes it very attractive for pressure groups. So if we deal with, what should we deal with first? If we deal with the Supreme Court appointments, then obviously members of the US Senate can be lobbied by pressure groups in order to support or oppose various Supreme Court nominations. Pressure groups might run adverts in their state saying, write to your senator and make sure he supports blah blah, or write to your senator and make sure he opposes blah blah blah. If you want some examples, I had a quick look. Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court judge who was appointed by Trump and went through all that hoo-ha in the Senate, there were lots of lobbyists in favour of him, and they ran adverts in a number of US states urging the senator for that state to approve Brett Kavanaugh. So you had things like the US Chamber of Commerce, the Koch brothers, KOCH, and the Republican Attorneys General Association. They supported Brett Kavanaugh and they ran adverts in a number of states. So there's a nice example for you. I didn't have a chance to look, but I'm sure you'd find a number of liberal pressure groups who no doubt ran adverts trying to oppose him being run. I do remember from the top of my head, the National Rifle Association ran adverts against Elena Kagan being appointed by Obama to the Supreme Court. They basically said, Sonia Sotomayor, she was anti-gun, Elena Kagan's also anti-gun. Make sure you vote for someone who isn't anti-gun, basically. In terms of foreign policy, the US Senate plays quite an important role, and therefore pressure groups with an interest in foreign policy can be involved. So AIPAC, that's a pro-Israel group. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, top of my head. But they basically were very much against the Iran nuclear deal under Obama, and they did a lot of lobbying of senators, Democrat and Republican, trying to get them to oppose and not support the Iran nuclear deal. They had a little association group called Citizens for a Nuclear-Free Iran, and they ran $40 million of adverts in 23 states against the Iran nuclear deal. So again, that's quite an influential group. They spent $22 million in 2018-19 lobbying members of Congress, senators and House members against Iran and in favour of pro-Israel policies. They donated to the Trump campaign, and they were very pleased when Trump moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem. What else can we say? Yeah, and of course, senators, of course, get elected. So again, just like the presidency and just like House members, they rely on money for election campaigns and stuff. Again, largely coming from pressure groups. So John Tester, the Democrat senator from Montana, it's a very countryside kind of state, lots of agriculture. His biggest contributor, I noticed, was the League of Conservation Voters. They gave $500 million to his election campaign. Ted Cruz, the Republican senator for Texas, he received $500,000 from AIPAC, this Israeli group. I'm not sure whether that's for his presidential attempt or for his actual Senate run, but anyway, received that amount of money. So again, money's involved in election campaigning, and again, those super PACs and stuff, you have pressure groups and business organisations involved in donating for or against people. Now, in terms of the House of Representatives, I don't have as many specific figures, but again, if you look at opensecrets.org, you can find some House members and see how much they were given. But they're a target for pressure groups because obviously they're very important in terms of legislation. Also, the members of the House are very susceptible to pressure groups because, of course, they're up for election every 2 years. So if you're in a competitive district, a swing district, then you're basically very reliant on money from pressure groups and stuff to obviously pay for your next election campaign. If you're from a safe kind of seat, or an uncontested seat, then that's less of an issue for you. Again, I didn't find any specifics, I didn't have time, but again, if you have a quick look on opensecrets.org, type in a couple of names of House members, you should be able to get some nice figures up there about how much money they received. In terms of lobbying, again, it's very much like the Senate. So obviously they don't lobby about foreign policy, but about domestic policy they would do. So the National Rifle Association, for example, often lobby members of Congress and House members not to have gun regulations. So I'm pretty sure from memory, after the Sandy Hook shooting, there was some talk about having anti-gun legislation. I think the NRA got very involved in trying to prevent that from getting anywhere amongst lobbying their House members. I was reading something to say that a lot of the farming interest groups, they used to have a lot of influence amongst House members because farming used to be more important, but it's a little bit less these days. But again, they'll affect certain House members who represent very rural districts. And then, of course, you've got other groups, things like the Christian Alliance and these sorts of pressure groups, who again will favour their agenda amongst House members. Now, regarding the judiciary, pressure groups kind of don't directly lobby them because obviously the judiciary have got to be independent. There are a number of ways in which they can influence the judiciary or make their views known. One is obviously the appointment system, how it comes from the president and then it goes to the Senate, and I've discussed that already earlier on, so I'm not going to repeat that one. You've also got something called amicus curiae briefs. So when the Supreme Court has got a case, pressure groups, it costs about $25,000 to $50,000. It's not a massive amount of money, hence why many groups do it. They'll send their view basically to the. It's called Friends of the Court. It's basically where a pressure group says these are the reasons why you should decide in favour or against this particular case. And some cases, some very controversial cases, will tend to have hundreds of these things. So, for example, Sebelius versus the NFIB, the Obamacare one, had hundreds of amicus curiae briefs. Oberfeld versus Hodges, the one that allowed gay marriage, had a large number of amicus curiae briefs. So very controversial ones have lots of these in particular. Now, how much influence they have is more conjecture, isn't it? Obviously, pressure groups think it's got some importance, otherwise why would they bother doing it? However, I think it's Clarence Thomas who said that how he never bothers to read them or something. So again, we don't know how much influence they have, but they obviously think it has influence, otherwise why would they bother doing it? I mean, I discovered that the Montana Sporting Association, of all groups, they sent an amicus curiae brief against Obamacare. I don't know why, I don't know what it said. I just seem to remember that one. So you've got amicus curiae briefs. You've obviously got the appointment system. Pressure groups as well. They might have protests and stuff outside the Supreme Court when there's big cases. And again, that's the same show, isn't it, of the Senate and the House when they're deciding important laws. You've got to have protest groups outside. Again, what influence they have is probably not much, especially for the judiciary. We will see that. And of course, the other big one for the judiciary is that test cases often come from pressure groups. So they'll either encourage someone to bring a case and then support them and finance the case for them, or they'll directly do it themselves. So if you think back, the NAACP in the 1950s, they actually had a number of test cases, didn't they, against segregation. So the Brown case, for example, the NAACP was very much involved in, which ended segregation down in the South for schools, for example. More recently, the Obamacare case, Sebelius versus the NFIB. Well, NFIB is a pressure group. It is the National Federation of Independent Businesses. That is a pressure group. Citizens United, which of course we've come across with the FEC and campaign finance. Well, Citizens United is a conservative pressure group. So any kind of case we come across where it's got the name of some kind of group in the title, that will do as a nice example of a case of a pressure group bringing forward a test case. I forgot to do the bit about why. The judiciary is obviously targeted, and you should know this when we've done all this about the Supreme Court, because the court's really powerful, isn't it? It's often the final say on public policy. So like with abortion rights, for example, They've been legal since the 70s, and the courts kind of always upheld abortion rights. Think about Obamacare. Obviously, those conservative groups failed. But there again, think about campaign finance, where the conservative groups were successful. So it's often the final say on these really important kind of controversial areas, and that is why pressure groups tend to target the judiciary. Okay, if they can't win to the lawmaking bit, then they might be able to get their own way through the judiciary. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes sense. You've got quite a few examples there. On this next table, it is essentially is how to compare the methods used by pressure groups in both countries. This should be fairly straightforward. So down the middle, I've put on some methods: financing elections, grassroots activity. What else have I got? Lobbying elected politicians and litigation, i.e. using the courts. So you need to use your notes from last year to think of areas where there's similarities between the US and UK in each of these areas, and areas where there's differences between the US and UK in the methods which they use. I mean, for example, in terms of litigation, you might say the UK has less kind of targeting the court system than the US does. Although that said, you do get test cases and stuff, which would be a similarity. A real big difference, of course, is the appointment of judges in the UK is not. Pressure groups are not involved in that in any way, shape, or form, whereas obviously they are in the US. So there's a few similarities and differences straight away, or just on the court bit. So if you can do that for me, which shouldn't take you too long, and then I've actually got a PowerPoint about lobbying and lobbyists. I'll either do it after I've had my lunch this afternoon, or I'll do it tomorrow. But that'll be the next video after this one. So keep your eyes peeled.